All right. Hello, everyone. We're live. This is our final Flutter Engage session. If you've stuck through with us for the other two, we definitely appreciate you attending this last one. We're going to have two parts to this session today. First is going to be a talk by Luke, and then Chris Sells will be joining us from from Google for a Q&A session as well. To give you a quick intro to Luke, he is a mobile engineer hailing from Maine. He has been a heavy contributor to the Flutter community over the last couple of years. He's actually currently the lead maintainer for Fluoro, which is a popular routing package. He has a diverse background spanning from consumer software to physical product design. He is a lead maintainer, again, of Fluoro and Sprung as well, which is a library for creating realistic animations. And we'll let him take this over.
All right. I am going to switch up my resolution on my computer, and then I'm going to share. We're going to try this. If the text is too small, just let me know, okay?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay, you guys all set?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, great. So my talk today is, I can't remember what the exact title is, but it's basically unusual architectures that deliver. And we're going to be looking at two. And we're going to take a quick look at a Firebase architecture that relies solely on extension methods to be able to build out service classes. And this is going to be like a super quick high-level look at how you kind of put it together. And I don't expect it to take more than 5 minutes. And this one's interesting because since you have all of these Firebase services, pretty much any Firebase service that you add to it, you can apply this method to it to get moving really quickly in an app in a way that's actually like pretty remarkably scalable, and all the separation, it's got all those good separations of concerns you're kind of looking for. So this one is actually available in a repo on my GitHub. It's called FB_Arch. And I'm just going to do a super quick walkthrough on this one. I recently used this to build a list app, and I found it to be incredibly fast to build. So the basic idea is you take something like, or you take for your public methods, you would go ahead and do an extension on user. And in this case, I've actually built kind of a little wrapping.
Luke, can you make the text a little bit larger? Sorry.
Absolutely. Give me 1 second.
Thank you. Much better. Thank you.
That working out for you?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Awesome. All right. So in this case, the basic idea, I'm just going to back up for a second. The basic idea is you put all of your public methods on Firebase app, and then you put all of your private methods, all of your authenticated methods on user. And so this is an example of it being on user. So you can see you have things like my public info, update my public info, and these are all authenticated actions, like update your avatar. And these wrap the base, like Firebase service classes that have extensions on them. So if we go into user public info, you'll see here we have extensions on the Firebase database class. And so you got your references, user public info. And what this is this allows you to get any user's public info, for example, and then you can like update user public info. But of course, that would have rules applied to it so that you couldn't do that unless you're authenticated. And then being able to fetch user private info, that would be on your self-authenticated. So you can see here that you kind of come in and you're like, okay, so we got Firebase database. What's important? We got our references, so we'll make extensions for that. We've got our methods, we'll make methods for that. And then when it comes time to access them, there's a few ways to do it, but the way that I've found that I enjoy is I make a basic mixin that accesses these static instances, and then you can actually mix it in on any class you can think of. So it kind of gets rid of the need for just like bringing it in as a variable or value every time you want to access these things. And I'll just give a real quick example of that here. So you can see here we've got like a login screen, and then we just mixed in with Firebase services. And because of that, we're allowed to access things like authentication and all sorts of other things. This example I didn't build out all the way, but you can see here that you'd be able to fetch, you'd get the user, private user info, public user info, and you can act on all that stuff. So just real quick, I'll give you some example of some of the some of the things you can do with these extensions. So like, if you go to use Firebase Auth, it's got all kinds of methods, but we can mix in some more, or we can blend in some more opinionated stuff. So we can actually go ahead and implement a sign-in with Apple. And I've done this before, and it's only like a couple lines of code, but when you're done with it, then you can just call Firebase auth.instance.signin with Apple, or you can use that mixin. And you can start adding in stuff that's more opinionated. So we have like a sign-in with Google Flow. And then when you go over to things like storage is a good example. You can have one where you can upload an avatar to a certain bucket with a certain file name. And all of these things is just a really nice way to go ahead and be like, okay, so we've got our storage service. You know, we're going to upload an avatar. We're going to upload like media for a post. We're going to upload all kinds like other stuff like that, like maybe an audio recording if you're building some kind of audio social app. And then you can even have like a backend developer come in here and start building out these extension methods and just supercharging your Firebase services without really having to do anything else. Now, the interesting thing about this too is that you actually get like a certain amount of loosely state management built in. So for example, when you're blending stuff into Firebase database, there's actually, from my experience, there's actually like a repository layer built into the Firebase database package or implementation on the native side. It also has like offline mode and all that stuff that you guys have probably already heard of. But because of that, what you can do is you can just kind of hammer data into it and then be listening to it in other places in the app, and it will instantly show up. It's not synchronous, but it's like that level of speed. It's like instantaneous async calls. So you can really just start pushing data in and listening to stuff in leaf nodes of the widget tree. And you can get you can start building out functionality like in really short amounts of time. And the API ends up working out super well because again, you're just mixing in that Firebase services mix in, and then you can access those items and just start building stuff out crazy fast. So that's the first one I wanted to show you. And so now we're going to move on to actually a topic that I just recently came across, which was doing stuff in Flutter with Redux, which is kind of funny because it's a topic that like is almost a little bit passé because, well, I think there's a few reasons for it. It seems to me that when Flutter first came on the scene, Redux was kind of a popular state management method. And I think at that time we had stuff like built value for doing data classes, but it was kind of verbose, and I don't think a lot of people were really a lot of people who are newer to the community weren't like very serious about using those kinds of tools. So I think that people kind of came into Flutter and they tried out Redux. They saw Redux Dart. They saw how verbose it was. They saw all that boilerplate, and they just got kind of turned off. And since then, we've had other things come up like block pattern, which then led to block package, and people starting to look seriously at change notifiers, because the change notifier class is built into Flutter. And if you wire it up with something like scoped model or provider, then you can actually like build out some pretty nice state containers pretty quickly. But I think that people moved on from Redux really quickly because they didn't like the boilerplate. And what's interesting is that just about a month ago, I was brought into a new project. And when I showed up, the project had been, a lot of the architecture had been spec'd out by a web developer, and their default, because they were a React developer, their default was to reach for Redux. And when I came into the app, I was kind of brought on to kind of look at things and make sure things are heading the right direction. And I took a look at the state management. And when I saw that they were using Redux, I remember thinking to myself very clearly, like we have to get rid of this. In Flutter, we don't use Redux. We use things like block. We use things like change notifier with provider and a couple other options. But pretty much across the board, I would guess that most Flutter developers just turn their nose up at Redux. And that was the reaction I had. And I remember kind of looking at it and thinking to myself, like, man, we really got to get rid of this. But then almost in my head, I could hear one of my mentors who, if he's watching this, he'll know who he is. But he basically said, one time he said to me, we were working on a project and I wanted to do a rebuild of it. And I remember him saying to me that most developers are not self-aware enough to realize that thoughtful refactors are a superpower. And what he meant by that is, I believe, is so many developers, they see something and they're not familiar with it. They know how they would solve these problems with another architecture. And so their first instinct is to tear out what they don't understand and put in what they do understand. And I remember him really stressing to me that the better way to go is to not switch architectures, but instead to bend and flex the existing one, and try to see what you can do with it. Because a lot of times what you'll find, and this is true, I have a short background in mechanical engineering. I think this is true in any engineering field. When you're like super familiar with something, there's an amount of bias built in where you really want to do something that you're comfortable with as opposed to trying to learn from it. But one of the super fascinating things about software is that software is just a collection of patterns, and if you follow the patterns through, you can really start to shake out lessons that can apply to so many other parts of software and can really inform the decisions that went into that particular project. So I was sitting there looking at this Redux architecture, and I thought to myself, you know what? Instead of just throwing this thing out, I know from experience and I know from being taught by my mentors that throwing it away is the first thing that you want to do, but it's usually the last thing you should do. And so what I did is I really decided to challenge myself to investigate Redux as a pattern that could work in Flutter apps. Because like I said earlier, I mean, it seems to be the community's opinion that nobody uses it and nobody should use it. And I really wanted to kind of question why that was. And I wanted to also question whether it was true that people don't use it. And I discovered a few things that I found really fascinating. And I wanted to go through just a basic Redux app example, and then maybe talk about things that I kind of realized along the way and directions that I think that we could go as a community. And I really challenge people to look at what's out there. Unfortunately, a lot of the packages are bit rotting now, and with null safety coming through, it looks like some of them are destined to rot even further. But I've been thinking about actually taking some of these packages under my own wing to get them up to null safety and kind of keep them current. I haven't committed to that, but it's something that I'm kind of toying with. And I think it's important because what I'm finding is, and a lot of you who have used it in the past in web dev might know that it's actually a pretty good pattern. And I think that a lot of the problems that people had with it, I think you can get past them with some of the advancements in Flutter and Dart that we've had in recent years. For example, in particular, freezed data classes, and also extension methods. So let's go ahead and just kind of get started. I'm not going to go over the Redux architecture itself or the strategies there, because you can find all kinds of information about that online. But let's go ahead and just dig into a couple things here. Now, the first thing that people complain about, admittedly, is boilerplate. And I actually have some examples of people complaining about boilerplate. So here, and they're totally founded, by the way. There is a lot of boilerplate in Redux, and I think that it's a fair criticism. So too much boilerplate with Redux, I hated it and quickly moved to something else. I totally get it. I think a lot of people have done that. Clunky is the least you can say. I don't know about your app, but when I tried it 2 years ago, action classes, reducers, and effects, it was a bit too much code for my taste. That's why I moved to MobX, which is a perfect thing to say, because for those of you who have used MobX, it's like the polar opposite of Redux, in that you just have a bunch of reactive fields and it's all code generation. But we're going to go ahead and talk a little bit about this here. So I heard someone once say, I think it was in that thread, say that another word for boilerplate code is boring code. And that's not, and they went on to say that's not such a bad thing. And I actually agree. So here we've got freeze data classes. And the reason why freeze data classes are so interesting here is because, like built value, they have a way to do copy with, and they generate to and from JSON methods. I know built value does a little bit differently, but they both achieve a similar outcome. And freeze does it with less boilerplate, in my opinion. But if you look at this, really, this is just two items. You have the class name, and you have one particular argument for the constructor. And so in Redux, you basically dispatch actions. There's a reducer that looks through the actions, sees what the action is, and then it mutates the state, and then it returns that mutated state. And that's Redux in a nutshell. So we're going to go through, we've got our actions. We've got hydrate store action to get data into the store, which is important for DevTools, and we'll get into that later if I remember. We have things like create a to-do, add multiple to-dos. If we're doing an async fetching operation, we can just set a little flag that says that we're fetching. You can delete the to-do, update, toggle, and then you can do something like set a visibility filter. Now, it's kind of funny because you look at this and you think to yourself, man, that's a lot of boilerplate for things that could just be fields. But when you look at it as use cases, it's actually not as crazy as you'd think. And you can go ahead and you can test each of these individual use cases very easily. What I found when I went to use this architecture is that, I mean, testing was was so simple. It's literally like, let's add to-dos and check that they're there. Let's create a to-do, let's toggle it, let's update it, let's delete it. And that's it. And so we've got the actions here, and we're going to go ahead through here, and we'll talk about the models. So these models, this is like the base store. This is the app state for the base store. And freeze lets us do the defaults, and also gives us the copy with, which we need for our reducers. And it gives us the serialization by default, which is going to end up being pretty important later. So you can see we've got the app state, and we've got a basic to do with task complete when it's due, and then the visibility filter. So now we're going to get to the reducer. And this is an area where I think that one of the biggest complaints that I heard in some of those threads was that if you're looking at the code and you try to follow, like, let's say let's see if I can pull one up. Okay, so let's say you're in this add to do dialog, and then you want to follow code through the create to do action. You get here, and it's kind of a dead end, right? You're like, okay, so where do I go from here? I don't really know how this is implemented. And I tried to code through, but I don't have it imported, so we can't do that. But it struck me as interesting that you could take this part of the reducer, and you could go back to your action, and you could in theory go ahead and, not on this directly, but there are some other ways to get methods on freeze classes. You could actually go ahead and put some kind of like static reducer function on there, and co-locate it. So I think that there's some ways to reduce that. Let's see here, what else we got? So we'll go through some of the reducers just to give an example. So we got the hydrate store, which basically takes the persisted state right here and just fits it right into the store. We've got, of course, our to-do actions. And then we also go ahead and for when we've got DevTools, we can go ahead and handle that so that we can handle any kind of actions that are generated by other tools without having any side effects, and still be able to throw a warning if there's an action coming through that we don't support. And you could even do like a throw unimplemented error on there if you wanted to make it more formal. So then we go on to selectors. Selectors are kind of interesting because Redux doesn't really have any derivative state built into it. It just has the core state, the data models. And so if you want derivative state, traditionally what you would do is you would use a selector to actually access the app state and turn it into derivative state. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but it ends up being a little wordy because you end up having to, in your code, you end up having to call something like complete to-dos selector, and then, you know, if you're doing static access, it could be redux.store.state, and not a lot of people want to do that. It's not very fluttery. It's kind of old school and functional in nature. But what I found interesting when I was playing around with this is that a lot of what you do with selectors, you can actually do now with extension methods. So using extension methods, you can do a lot of you can do all your derivative state with extension methods. And then if you run into a situation where you want to use selectors, because a lot of the selectors, if you're like combining selectors, you have a way to memoize the results. You can actually go ahead, if you're using this pattern in the app, you can actually you can actually use a selector behind the scenes and have it be completely opaque to the consumer. So I found that really interesting because that in and of itself, you get to use a lot of the same performance, and you get to do a lot of the same optimizations you would otherwise. But you also get the ease of access and discoverability of being able to say like appstate.passToDos instead of having to go through and I deleted it, but having to go through and call it like I said earlier. Now, I'll show a quick example of Thunks, and then I'm going to go on to the free stuff, which I think is the most important thing. So Thunks are kind of a funny way of saying, let's have a asynchronous method that might like dispatch something, await a future, or do some kind of network call, and then dispatch other actions after that. And it's kind of the first way that you can start getting into asynchronous calls using Redux. So in this case, what we're doing is we're fetching adventures to-dos. So we'll set that we're fetching is true. We'll mock a long network call. And then we'll add the to-dos to build a canoe, paddle the Allagash, and build a log cabin. And then when we're done adding those, then we'll set the fetching action defaults. Now, what's interesting here is that Thunks are a little bit clunky, as the name itself is kind of sounds like it's clunky, but there are other options. And for those of you who have used Redux in the past, you'll know about sagas and epics. And what I found really interesting about sagas, I think it was sagas in particular, is that they actually follow a pretty common pattern now in Flutter, which is those union events where you have like idle fetching or idle loading, success with data, and then error with error message. So if you look into sagas, I believe that if you're a block fan, that you will find that it matches a lot of the same mental models that you're used to. So that's kind of interesting. So that is Thunks. Now we're going to get onto the part of the Redux, which I think is probably the most compelling part, because you can look at this and say to yourself, okay, this is kind of clunky. I prefer dealing with methods instead of these actions. Although, as I understand it, if you're in the block, then you're used to dealing with actions, so maybe that's not a problem for you. But what's super interesting is that you get a lot of tooling for free with Redux. So because we're using freeze, the entire state tree is serializable, which means that it's really quite easy to persist. So I'll give you a quick example. We've implemented a storage engine here, which is really just converting data to something that can be stored by shared preferences and then back again, which makes it multi-platform. And it's not the fastest thing on the planet, but it's never failed to work for me, and I've never had performance issues with it. And here in where you create the store, you can very easily add this persistence layer just by checking if there was any persisted state, and if there was, you can put it up front in front of initial state when you go to hydrate the store, and then you add it to the middleware, and that's it. And there's nothing else you have to do. You don't have to handle persistence in all of your state classes. You don't have to handle it for individual fields in MobX. So you can basically persist the entire store with about a 5 to 10 minute setup, and then you never have to think about it again. So that, I think, is a massive benefit of Redux that I think people overlook. The other thing that I think that people overlook is that because everything is coming through the store as actions and then out into the store as diffs, you can actually add a logging middleware to it. And that logging middleware can be anything. It can be local logs, it can be remote logs. And again, it's just, you drop it in and it just works, and you never have to set it up for anything else. You do 10 minutes of setup and you never have to think about it again. It's done. That's it. And I think, I mean, a lot of people don't really worry too much about logging, but if you look at any like decent sized app, the amount of time that gets spent in logging stuff thoughtfully is actually quite extensive. And so if we're generating all those strings with freezed, and then everything's coming through the store as actions and as state diffs, then getting that stuff out for free is actually quite a decent time saver. So I think that people don't really appreciate how much time that saves. And then the next thing I'll say about this, before we go on to some additional thoughts, is I have not seen this in any other state management system in Flutter, and that's the ability to use DevTools. So I'm going to try to do a real quick example here. I have it set up, but we'll make sure that it's actually working. And for people who've done web dev, you'll look at this and you'll say, oh yeah, I've seen this before. But maybe you missed it. Maybe you wish you had access to it in Flutter. And for people who haven't done web dev before, who've done Flutter dev only, this stuff can look like absolute magic. So I'm going to make sure this thing is working. See if we can add a to-do. And if it's not, I'm going to go ahead and do a refresh here. Okay, that's up. That's up. Great. Okay. Now this gets to that hydrated store piece. So the reason I do the hydrated store, because you could easily just do an initial state. The reason I do the reason why we hydrate the store is because then it allows you to get all of that state in right up front for the purpose of looking at it through DevTools. So let's go ahead and we'll add a couple adventurous to-dos. And we will go ahead and say, okay, we're going to delete this one because we don't need it anymore. So we'll go ahead and we're going to build a canoe, paddle the Allagash, build a log cabin, and then somewhere in there we will finish up this live stream. Go ahead and save that, and then we're not done with that yet, so we'll leave it. But if you come in here, what you'll notice is that as I was doing that, all these actions were coming through into remote DevTools. And you can actually kind of click through and you can actually see what the entire state tree is. And it's really interesting because when I've worked on web projects that have access to this, we use it all the time. But when I work on Flutter projects, I don't know if it's because we have access to hot reload where people they feel like they can just play around with it more, or maybe because we have better access to debug tools, they feel like it's not so important. But being able to actually watch the actions come through in a way that you can see what the diffs are, I think is incredibly useful. And what's also interesting is you can even go ahead and see here. You can even go ahead and you can scroll through the state changes. So it's got a built-in history model, and you can use it to actually, there you can see that's in the middle of the loading state. So when the loading was done, that went, and then there you go. So anyway, so this is now we're going to have it throw an error, of course, but Let's see what happens if we restart this, just out of curiosity. All right, we're doing all right. So that I think is something that has quite a lot of implications for people who are building declarative Flutter apps. And what, like, back when Redux was first being used in Flutter, for example, we didn't really have any declarative navigation available to us. But now with Navigator 2.0, which is a whole other topic, it kind of gives us a glimmer of being able to do declarative routing. And once you can do declarative routing, then you can have all your router state in the tree and have it all declarative. And you would be able to actually scroll through and see people navigating through different parts of the app. And what this allows us to do, one of the things that this allows us to do that's really interesting is actually to go ahead and start thinking about doing things like if an app crashes, then you can do a state tree dump and send it off to some sort of error reporting service, some kind of crash reporting service. And then your developer can actually take that state tree dump and they can import it through DevTools into your Redux app and be able to put the app, if everything's declarative, which I think we're getting close to because of Navigator 2.0, you can put the entire app, you can put your entire development environment back into the exact state that it was in prior to crashing. You might have to throw in maybe a different like user token or something like that. But you can get it right back to where it was, and you even have the opportunity, if you are able to also dump like the last 5 actions, for example, you would even be able to, go to where it crashed and then back 5 actions, and you'd be able to move forward and back. And that has huge debugging implications that are already being used by web developers. And I see no reason why we couldn't also use them with Flutter. So I think that's something that people are aren't really like thinking about when they look at Redux. I think that what happens is what's happened is people made up their mind about Redux. I think that people made up their mind about Redux in the early days, before we had access to declarative routing, before we had data classes with full serialization that people were comfortable with using, and before we had access to extensions. And I think that it gave birth to a lot of really great state management patterns. But there's something about Redux, it's hard to put my finger on, that it's like I'm looking at a glimmer of an architecture that in Flutter with these new tools could give us the ability to build very large applications with very low complexity. And I'm just going to share a couple tweets that I think are important to keep in context and might be a little bit interesting. Some of them are indifferent, some of them are glowing, and we'll just go through them fairly randomly. So in support of Redux, this is from Gunter. Says, I find it's good for beginners. If they follow some simple rules, it's hard to make a big ball of mud. So code review and a nudge here and there are enough to keep the code maintainable. With Angular, I use NGRX and it's much sleeker. Dart's type system makes it quite verbose. So again, it's a verbosity concern, but it is still a pretty glowing review all the way around. Mohammed Guler from Superlist says, we use Redux at Superlist as well. One big advantage is it is good for beginners. If your beginners have programming experience, you just tell them the rules and they follow until they get used to using Flutter. John Ryan has a mixed review. He says, I think about Redux as the command. I kind of think of Redux as the command pattern. It's not always great for big apps. Some people would agree and disagree with him there. But he says, but for certain screens or small apps, it's really handy. It's also easier to test in my experience. And that's something that I've been finding too, is that the testability of it is very straightforward, much more straightforward than I anticipated. This one is a little bit of review of differences. Redux is out of fashion, but it's fundamentally reduced function. What's there to hate? I think it's more the issue of it not doing enough automatically, which I think is really important because, and this is what I find really interesting, is that a lot of state management systems do a lot of things automatically, but they also miss out on some things like persistence logging, DevTools. So it's almost like Redux gives you access to some things that we just don't even think of as features. And I think that if people got access to them, they'd appreciate them more. Craig said, I've done mountains of Redux and JS, and in my experience, Redux core strength is that its complexity is always constant. This is what I'm seeing glimmers of personally. Whether you're writing a blog or Gmail, if that's true, this would obviously make it a better fit the more complicated your app is. And this, I can't really say the same about any other architecture, although he does go on to say that block is kind of in this category. So that said, I've also found his boilerplate to be extremely prohibitive. Again, another person who's talking about boilerplate, totally valid, because I'm rarely writing anything actually intense enough to really capitalize on Redux. For my Flutter apps, Freeze plus Flutter block provide that sweet spot of a less boilerplate Redux. Now, this is interesting too, because in that thread, people went on to compare block with Redux. And when the block package first came out, I remember my first reaction was, it looks to me like this is Flux pattern done with streams and some like async star, some Darty things that the other programming languages don't have. But he says Redux and block are really similar. Reducers are kind of like blocks. Actions are kind of like events. State is state. And then action creators are implicit in Flutter block, but worth replicating. Unless I've overlooked something, it's a question of which boilerplate you prefer to capture in snippets. So it almost seems like it nets out. And the other thing I'll say is that Max Lapides from Tonal said that Tonal Mobile is built on Redux with built value because Freeze didn't exist in 2018. And he says that Redux has been good for managing data state, but our current implementation leaves a lot to be desired. And I can't speak for Max, but it'd be interesting to know what he would think if he had a chance to take a look at Redux again with some of the new tooling and things like extensions and freezed and other, and the potential of fully declarative navigation. It would be interesting to see if that would help solve the implementation issues that he's alluding to, or if he would still be, or if he would still have the same issues. And then finally, we've got Gunter again saying, a colleague set up Redux remote tools for Flutter. It's not fully working out, but I find it really cool. I'm using the same dev tools for Angular. And then he basically asks about whether there's any benefits of Freeze because he's using built value. So he's using built value to access a lot of the stuff that I showed you today. So that is the long and short of what I've got to share with everybody today on the stream. And I just want to say, one of the things that I find really fascinating is that a lot of developers really latch on to whatever is the newest thing. And when you get down to it, especially in state management, a lot of the patterns that are being released as packages are just people kind of re-rolling the same basic patterns over and over and over and over again. And I feel like in the world of front end, we've been through so many iterations of state management that I'm not convinced that each time it's re-rolled that anyone's actually gaining any net benefit. I think it just shifts the concerns and the issues and the pros and the cons around. And I would challenge people to really give Redux another look, because while I agree that it does have issues in terms of boilerplate, I also think that it does some things for free that cost you a lot more than you might expect in other architectures. And for that reason, I don't think that it's a net loss to use Redux. I think that it is totally viable. And if, like me, you run into another project, you start working on another project that's brownfield code, and it's using Redux, instead of turning your nose up at it, really give it a chance and see what you can learn from it, because you might actually be pleasantly surprised with what you can do with it and what it can teach you. And that's what I've got.
Luke, this was excellent. Thank you for what you've given. This is I love a rehash of different ways of considering how you can manage state and how you can do work with extensions. Just to do a little bit of housekeeping, if anybody wants to ask questions, there's a couple of ways that you can do this. One is you can just use the chat. The other is we can invite you up to the stage to speak. The way we invite you to the stage is you can either just say in the chat, hey, I want to chat, or you can raise your hand at the very top right. And we can have up to 16 people on here. So for whatever that's worth.
Party.
But yeah, we can have a party. This tool maxes out at 100,000 people, which is pretty cool. If you have questions, this is the perfect time to ask. Oh, we do have two. I guess, well, Ryan, you've asked them. Do you want to?
Yeah, I had a couple, I guess you could call them basic questions. So the first one was, and I think you kind of touched on that a little bit in your talk, but it might be nice for you to rehash it. Why would you use Redux instead of block?
Yeah, so I think that there's nothing wrong with block. Okay, there's nothing wrong with block. There's nothing wrong with change notifier. I have a personal preference to use change notifier. I guess what I'm saying is there's nothing wrong with Redux. And I think that there's this misconception in the community that there is something wrong with Redux. And I'm challenging that head on. I'm saying, listen, you look at Redux, the packages are starting to rot, which I think needs to be fixed, and something that I'm actively considering fixing. Because it would be a shame to lose this pattern completely. I think it's old gold in a way, if that makes any sense, where it's like a lot of people know how to use it. You can bring web developers into a project using Redux. You don't have to teach them anything. Block doesn't really exist in any other world other than Flutter. I know that it's been ported to other places, but you're not going to call up like a Swift developer and be like, here, write this Swift app in Block. They're going to be like, what are you talking about? Just like same with web developers. So I have no problem with Block. It's just that Redux is almost like this. It's taken as like a given that pretty much every front-end developer has at some point used Redux. And so I think that alone is a power that people don't really appreciate. And I just think it gives you so much stuff for free that I had just completely ignored. Robust logging is important. DevTools, I don't know that it exists in Block. If it does, I would love to know about it, but I haven't seen it. The ability to dump the entire state tree and then rehydrate it at a later date for the purpose of debugging. I'm not aware of anything else that does that in like 5 lines of code. So there's all kinds of stuff like that that I think is super important. So it's just some things to think about. Someone's correcting me saying that Block has DevTools. Now that I see that, I'm definitely going to check it out. But that is one of a few examples, I think. And I should be clear, I'm not up here saying that Redux is better than anything. I will be the first person to tell you that I think that every state management solution that has been popular in the last 10 years has applications. And I just think that it's unwise to pretend that Redux does not have a place in Flutter apps. I don't think that that's fair.
Yeah, I actually did not know that Block has DevTools, so I'd be interested in playing around with that as well. News to me. Another question that I had is, what do you think of the Redux-inspired packages? So I think the most popular one might be Async Redux, but then there's also VxState, Meow Channel, RX Redux. I don't know if you'd heard of
And there's
any of
also,
those.
what is it, Fish Redux, the one from Alibaba, I think it
Yep.
was.
Mhm.
Yeah, so this is full disclosure. I haven't played with those because I've been playing with the core tool set. But I think someone could make an argument that they exist for a reason, because I think that people realize that the pattern is worth preserving in various forms. I have a suspicion, and I don't know, obviously, I can only be over here suspecting, but I have a suspicion that Fish Redux exists because of a lot of the Redux packages rotting. I don't know that that's true. I can only guess, but it's something that came to my mind when I was looking at their package.
How big of a lift do you expect it'll be to avoid the rot or help bring it up to state?
Well, what's interesting is that I was looking at the packages, and most of them have a null safety PR, but the people who created those packages, they've gone AWOL, it looks like. So I think there are definitely people out there using Redux, and there are definitely people out there making the PRs to keep these things fresh. But it just looks like the people who were using Redux were using Flutter early, and then maybe they moved on to another state management system, or maybe they moved on from Flutter altogether, and they're no longer around maintaining these packages. And so there's just nobody to triage those pull requests. I've tried to reach out to a couple people offering assistance, but I haven't heard back. So I think a lot of these people have just moved on to other communities.
Fair point. Any other questions, either in the chat or outside? I know Ryan is getting us these DevTools. Yes, awesome.
Yeah, I want to see these for sure.
Thanks. Thank you for the link.
The other thing I'll say that I find interesting, and it'd be interesting to hear Felix's take on this. I think it's Felix. It seems like Block was designed to take the best of Redux and try to rewrap it into something more consumable in the world of Flutter and Dart. And I don't know if that's something that he would confirm or deny, but it's something that I start to see glimmers of when I compare the two architectures.
Yeah, that's definitely the feeling I've always gotten, is that it's kind of like it adds the things that were missing to the original implementation of Redux, things like being able to do side effects that were, glaring omissions from the original Redux implementation.
Yeah.
Also, by the way, Luke, kudos on using the term mental models and doing it appropriately. That always makes me smile.
I don't remember.
You did. So I have this as well as the YouTube stream up at the same time, and I put a comment in the stream because I can't do this while I'm recording it. But I linked over, there's I don't know if you ever listen to any books from or read any books from Charles Duhigg, but he does a really good description of that specifically. And I hear that term often misused, and you did it very well. So
good job. Thank you. I appreciate that. I'll take the compliment any day.
Sounds good.
Yeah, another thing that I thought was cool, not necessarily a question, was I thought the idea of using a mixin for your Firebase services is pretty nifty. I'm definitely going to take that.
Agreed. Yeah. No, I greatly appreciated that, plus the power that you can see with extensions. I thought that was I think there's a lot more that I can learn on that. So I'm definitely going to be rewatching and trying to test it out in some of my own code.
It's definitely worth playing with, because if you have an app that's heavy Firebase, you've got something that looks like a database, something that looks like media storage, something that looks like analytics. And those are oftentimes services that people write from scratch. So it's like, why not take those and just start adding your opinionated methods to it and then just access it that way? And I just found that it was just an absolutely blazingly fast way to build an app without really giving up much at all. And what's cool too is because they're extensions, you can break them up into multiple extensions if they get too large, and you can just keep feeding them in. You can keep wrapping the functionality with some sort of wrapper class, like how I had that service class for I think it was user.service. So you can start namespacing it whenever you want. And the migration, when you do that stuff, is like really simple.
You had mentioned that. Was that also something that was easier to test, or was that more in the Redux discussion?
That was in the Redux. That was in the Redux section. From what I can tell, when you start building up Firebase, stuff like that, I think they have better tools now for integration testing. But I think a lot of that you end up doing, like if I was going to start testing an app with that architecture that I showed in the beginning, the first place I'd be looking is just raw integration testing, where you'd be integration testing like flows more than doing like unit testing. But that's just what I think of when I am trying to like fit like a quick building architecture with like a quick testing architecture, because I'm assuming that in that type of app you're trying to iterate really fast. And so wrapping the testing in some sort of integration test and doing flows just kind of makes sense to me. But I'm sure there's other ways to do it.
Got it. Thank you.
Anybody else got any other questions?
So I guess, so we have a couple options that we could do right now while we are waiting for the second section of this meetup. I think Chris is, I don't know if he has joined yet.
Chris is here.
Yes,
he's
okay.
Joined.
So what we could do is we could just invite him up to the stage and keep going, which is probably going to be, I think, the easiest flow. And then after this discussion, if anybody is interested, we can show you some of the interesting things of this tool, where if you were, well, I can't see this because I'm up on the stage, but you can go to the lounge and you can actually do breakout groups and have discussions in between. So Chris, we're going to add you onto the stage, and Ryan, I will let you take it away.
Cool.